The dawn in Seattle brought with it a thick fog that stretched like a ghostly veil over Pineview Lake. The air carried a scent of dampness and decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow. It was in this gloomy setting that a morning jogger came to a sudden halt, shock written all over his face as he saw something floating in the water. A shiver ran down his spine, and the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The arrival of the police shattered the silence with sirens and hurried orders, and Detective Gideon Blake, with his rigid posture and calculating mind, analyzed the scene. Every detail was processed with obsessive precision. The body of a young woman, pale and lifeless, swayed gently with the lake's ripples, covered with symbols carved into her skin with a precision that suggested something ritualistic. Gideon observed with a heavy foreboding, this was no ordinary crime scene. The connection to the New Hope community, a cult with a reputation shrouded in mystery and fear, seemed inevitable, yet the confirmation of it made him uneasy. As he stepped away from the water, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was unfolding, as if the city of Seattle itself stood on the brink of a dark revelation. Time felt like it was running against him, and every second increased his unease. In the heart of the city, Nora Sullivan, an independent journalist, reviewed her notes feverishly. Her small office, filled with newspaper clippings, photographs connected by red strings, and detailed maps, was a sort of sanctuary for her investigations. For months, she had chased leads on the cult but had never come across anything this concrete. The news of the discovery at the lake was a call to action, proof that her fears were not unfounded. As the sun barely pierced the fog, Nora felt the chill of a truth about to be revealed. Seattle held ancient and dangerous secrets, and both Gideon and she were closing in on something that could consume everything around them. The headquarters of the New Hope community lay hidden deep in the dense forests north of Seattle, where sunlight barely touched the moss-covered ground. The place exuded an oppressive presence, as though the very earth harbored dark secrets. The cult's followers, in their immaculate white clothes, moved with an unsettling synchronicity, and everything there seemed unnaturally clean and orderly. At the center of this unnerving microcosm was Eli Masters, whose piercing gaze and hypnotic voice kept everyone under his sway. While Eli spoke of salvation and transcendence, there was something deeper in the way he controlled his followers, something invisible yet uncomfortable, like a feeling that seeped into the skin. He was more than a leader, he was the driving force behind something dark and growing. In the city, Detective Gideon Blake, immersed in his room full of old case files, felt the weight of the cold walls and the smell of aging paper. Pictures of missing people, all linked to Eli Masters' cult, seemed to stare at him, demanding justice. He flipped through reports with unrelenting focus, but one new discovery made him stop, a forgotten document mentioning rituals involving human offerings. A sense of urgency began to form, as though time was slipping through his fingers. Nora Sullivan, on the other hand, walked with determined steps toward the cult's gate, though each step seemed to weigh more on her chest. Her heart raced faster, and she forced herself to breathe steadily. Her hands trembled slightly, a cold sweat collecting on her neck, and memories of past dangerous investigations surfaced, a death threat left at her door months earlier, or the sound of unknown footsteps trailing her one night. As she approached the gate, the tension reached its peak. One of the guards, standing stiffly, fixed his eyes on her. For a moment, his lips curled into a smile that seemed to know her, as if he had expected her to come. Nora swallowed hard, feeling as though she were walking into a trap that the cult had patiently set. At that same moment, back in Gideon's office, the detective stumbled upon something even more disturbing, a link to an old network of power in Seattle, suggesting the cult had allies far more influential than he had imagined. The tension hung in the air, and both were about to cross a point of no return. Gideon's investigation intensified as he examined each document, every faded photograph, and each account of a disappearance. The archive room, cold and austere, seemed to close in around him as his eyes fixed on a troubling pattern, a series of disappearances occurring each decade, all somehow linked to the New Hope community. The dates weren't coincidences, there was a methodical regularity suggesting something far more sinister. Gideon rubbed his temples, feeling the growing pressure. The cult wasn't just an isolated group but a force that had infiltrated the lives and history of the city. He knew he was closing in on something significant, but also dangerous. The feeling of being watched was no longer just paranoia, he could sense the presence of a shadow that followed his every step. Meanwhile, Nora managed to infiltrate the cult's territory, posing as a curious visitor seeking spiritual answers. The reception was cordial, almost excessively warm, and Nora's hands trembled as she held a pamphlet explaining the community's doctrine. The atmosphere felt surreal, children running happily, adults smiling serenely, yet there was a disturbing lack of spontaneity, as though every gesture had been rehearsed. She was led to a meditation pavilion, where followers sat in silence, listening to Eli Master's voice echoing through speakers, like an invisible force controlling every mind present. Nora took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but panic rose in her throat when she noticed small symbols etched on the walls, the same ones she had seen in old documents. Her investigation was becoming increasingly personal, and now she knew the cult's secrets were closer to her than ever before. Back in central Seattle, Gideon faced new obstacles. His superior at the police department, who had always supported him, suddenly seemed hesitant to help. Interrupted phone calls and orders to proceed cautiously made him suspicious. Gideon began to understand that the cult wasn't just an isolated sect, it was rooted in spheres of power within the city. Nora and Gideon were on separate paths, but they were converging quickly. The obstacles they faced weren't mere coincidences or bureaucratic hurdles. It was the cult, an entity moving in the shadows, protecting its secrets with a network of influence and fear. The tension that had been building in the past few days was starting to overflow. Gideon spent long hours sifting through old files, but that night, the discovery of an underground hideout on the cult's property hit him like a punch of reality. Photos of the hidden cave revealed symbols carved into the walls, markings that seemed to carry an ancient, pulsing significance. Remnants of candles, carefully arranged, surrounded a rudimentary altar stained with something he dared not imagine. The detective pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to push away the fear threatening to breach his logical defenses. He remembered an old case, a disappearance that had left him sleepless for nights, but this was different. The cave seemed to whisper stories that defied the laws of reason, as though the stones themselves held living memories. The cold air of the archive room seemed to deepen, and for the first time in years, Gideon wondered if he was prepared for what was coming. Meanwhile, Nora sought refuge in a dimly lit cafe in downtown Seattle. The strong smell of burnt coffee and the acrid scent of an extinguished cigarette mixed in the air, creating a sense of discomfort. Sitting by the window, she tried to calm her nerves. The environment seemed safe, but her senses were heightened. Every sound, the clink of a cup, the creak of a chair, felt louder than it should. Then, her phone vibrated with an anonymous message, "Leave while you still can, or there won't be a next time." Cold sweat trickled down her neck. She scanned the room, her eyes searching familiar and unfamiliar faces. Fear was a physical presence, pressing down on her chest. A hooded figure appeared briefly on the sidewalk, but when Nora turned to look closer, they had already vanished into the darkness. Stepping out of the cafe, the chilly wind made her shiver. She felt vulnerable, but the message was clear, the cult knew she was too close to the truth. Gideon and Nora, both facing the unknown, were about to be engulfed by a web of mystery and danger closing in fast around them. The sky over Seattle was heavy with dark clouds, as if the city itself sensed the impending showdown. On that day, the police, under the command of Gideon Blake, prepared a covert operation to raid the New Hope community's headquarters. Every move was meticulously planned, but the air was thick with uncertainty. Gideon felt the weight of responsibility, and the cold sweat in his palms betrayed the tension he was trying to hide. The cult was not an ordinary enemy, it was a force with roots in places he couldn't even fathom. As the team gathered, Gideon scanned his colleagues, looking for signs of weakness or betrayal. One agent, in particular, seemed off. His movements were slow, and the gaze he cast at Gideon was empty, as if his loyalties were divided. A shiver ran down Gideon's spine, the thought that the cult might have infiltrated the police force felt more real than ever. Across the city, Nora approached the site of the ritual, driven by a mix of fear and determination. She had followed clues to this point, but the sense that something was profoundly wrong kept her on high alert. The environment around her seemed to pulse with an invisible energy, and she wondered if it was her mind playing tricks or if there was truly something supernatural in the air. The smell of damp earth and charred wood made her feel like she was walking into the mouth of danger itself. The raid began with a burst of chaos. Officers stormed the cult's grounds but were met with fierce resistance. The followers fought with a wild determination, their eyes ablaze with a devotion that bordered on the supernatural. Even when wounded, they continued to advance, as if fear and pain held no sway over them. Gideon led the offensive, but the battle's chaos made him realize they were dealing with something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. A hooded figure slipped away through an underground tunnel, and Gideon knew he had to follow, even if it meant leaving his team behind. Nora, hidden among the trees, watched the mayhem unfold. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her shoulder, and she turned, her heart pounding, to see a familiar face, a former follower she had interviewed months earlier. But his eyes were vacant, as if his soul had vanished. He trembled as he handed her a wooden symbol, pulsating with a sinister energy. His lips murmured incoherent words before his body collapsed, lifeless, like a puppet without strings. The cult was revealing its claws, and both Gideon and Nora were closer to the heart of the mystery, and more exposed to the deadly danger surrounding them. Night enveloped Seattle in an almost impenetrable darkness, and the cult's headquarters now looked like a silent ruin. The confrontation had left its mark, debris scattered across the grounds, captured followers, and a heavy silence replacing the chaos. But the hooded figure, Eli Masters, was still at large, and Gideon knew the danger wasn't over. The underground tunnel exuded a thick, suffocating air, saturated with moisture and a sense of foreboding. Gideon moved forward with firm steps, but his mind was waging a silent war. The cave walls, covered in ancient symbols, seemed to pulsate, exuding an energy that pressed down on his shoulders. Fear poked at his mind, a constant presence trying to infiltrate his logic. Yet the determination that defined him kept him moving forward, even when he felt the darkness he faced was more alive and deeper than any he had ever known. In the final chamber, Eli Masters awaited with a serene smile, his eyes shining with a madness that bordered on divinity. He spoke of immortality and power, of a promise of transcendence that had seduced so many. But Gideon knew there was no salvation here, only despair and control. With one final effort, he managed to subdue Eli, the struggle unfolding more in the realm of willpower than physical strength. The cult leader's capture did not erase the evil he had spread, but it was a crucial step in breaking the cycle. Meanwhile, Nora was back in her office. The wooden symbol lay on her desk, pulsing with a meaning she didn't fully understand. The smell of stale coffee mixed with the early morning air, and the newspaper clippings around her seemed to come alive under the dim light. Nora knew the victory was bittersweet, the cult had fallen, but the scars it left were deep. Even so, she prepared to write the article exposing the whole truth, knowing her fight for justice was far from over. Gideon and Nora, separated by the city, reflected on their journeys. Gideon wondered how many secrets still lurked in the shadows, while Nora knew her search for the truth was an ongoing battle. Their paths, though distinct, were united in the fight against an enemy still hovering over Seattle. The truth had been revealed, but the shadows, as always, waited patiently for the next call.